Välkommen allesammans! When you think of Vikings, you think of big, strong men charging off their ships, villages burning, battle drums pounding, and in recent times the drum is actually the main focus of many musical projects with the Viking theme. But we have basically no conclusive evidence that drums were used or even existed during the Viking Age. However, we have a whole lot of history and interesting clues in the Norse sources and neighboring cultures that suggest some sort of percussion instruments were an essential part not only to ritual and spirituality, but also battle. So those sources are what we are going over in this video. So first thing, of course they had drums. Every primitive culture in the world has had some tradition of drum use, whether it be our modern instruments, even made completely electronically, or the Siberian or the Sami tribes stretching a reindeer hide over a wooden frame just like these that I sell. Or if it's a monkey banging a stick on a tree. Any creature with opposable thumbs that can pick up something likes to bang it on things and make a powerful kicking noise out of it. But we really can't call all of these things a drum, right? So we should really say percussion instruments. Even though we have no clear evidence that drums were used in the Viking Age, of course they had some sort of percussion in order to make sound for various purposes. But to get a good idea of the full picture, we need to go a bit deeper on the sources. First, we can look at the oldest records. We actually do have a couple records of the Germanic tribes all the way up to the Viking Age, banging on their shields before going into battle. We can kind of count this as drumming. Again, all cultures did something like this if we go back far enough, but the Germanic tribes, the ancestors of the Vikings, seem to have a much more spiritual nature to this pre-battle ritual. Here is one source how they would use their shields in order to amplify their voices, and growls, which was done to bring them courage and bring fear into their enemies before battle. So drumming with spears on the shields and growling on the shields seems to be a thing that all Germanic tribes did, at least what was said here. Now, this was 700-800 years before the Viking Age. Was it still done in the Viking Age? Don't know, it could be, but it may be possible. But in the Norse sources, the only record we have of anything resembling drums comes in Lokasenna, the poem about Loki taunting the gods, and as an insult to Odin, depending on the translation that you're reading, but Loki says that Odin was so unmanly that he dressed himself up as a witch and struck on the drum like a völva. This is really not a good translation here. And it's very difficult to translate, and I've seen a lot of garbage ones, some good ones though. Definitely that word that you see there, draptu, or the present form drepa, means to strike or sometimes stab in Old Norse. But the word vet, we really can't say for certain what it means. It doesn't mean drum. We're pretty sure that it doesn't mean drum, even though some people like to translate it that way, but it could mean more something like a lid, like striking on a lid, like a lid of a chest or a barrel or a bucket. Hold that thought, because I'm gonna come back to that in a minute. One more source is actually an Arabic source, Ibn Fadlan, an Arabic traveler documenting a funeral of a Rus Viking chieftain in the east of Europe, and here the chieftain was buried and eventually cremated with nabit, as it says here, intoxicating drinks, which would be something like alcohol, or maybe something a bit more than that. He was buried with fruit and a drum. Now, I don't have the original source of this, and I don't read Old Arabic either, so I can't say. Some people have translated this word to be drum. Some people have translated it to mean a stringed instrument. So the old-fashioned drums are definitely a stringed instrument, so you can see here. So that could be what they're talking about, but we're not sure, and that's basically the best source that we have. No sources about drums in the Norse texts. That's to be expected, though, because they were written by Christians, trying to hide various aspects of the pagan religion, especially the funerals. Almost no information is given about the funerals in any of the Norse sources. They very deliberately skip over it. But we don't really have any archaeological evidence of drums used in the Norse world either. That's also to be expected, okay? A reindeer hide wrapped around a wooden frame would not have survived buried in the ground for more than 1,000 years, so we are not going to find any of these in the archaeological finds. I will say, though, in the neighboring Sami tradition, drums could sometimes be shaped like buckets. When drums were made illegal and missionaries were confiscating the drums from the Sami all the way up until the 1800s, one scholar, Dag Strömbäck, in his book, observed the Sami hitting on buckets with drumsticks during their, kind of shamanic-like rituals. And we actually do have one grave from the Viking Age in Birka, Sweden, that we are pretty sure is a bucket, and inside of that bucket is a drumstick, what very much resembles a drumstick. It's just one burial with a bucket and the drumstick, but buckets by themselves have actually been found in a lot of graves from the Viking Age. Why a bucket of all things? Why would a bucket be so important to be buried with? Well, maybe the bucket could have been used as a percussion instrument and was a important spiritual tool, important enough to be buried with, at least for a certain class of people, like the witches, spiritual leaders, that kind of thing. But that's about all the info we have from the Norse world on drums. To really fill in the blanks, we have to go to the neighboring Sami culture, and they absolutely have a long tradition of drums. They are a different genetic group, different family of language, religion, and culture, but they are very close and connected to the Norse. The Norse actually went to the Sami, or back then they called them all Finns. They went to them for most of their spiritual guidance. So even if the Norse didn't have a traditional drum that they used in their culture, they would have known what a drum is just from their contact with the Finns and Sami. The Sami drum is very similar in function to the related Siberian or even the Native American shamanism type drums. The drum in the Sami tradition is called the Govdis or Gobdis or the Mevrians. I can't pronounce Sami words, but you see them right here. In Norwegian, it's called the runebomme, or the rune drum, and interestingly enough, and in Swedish, it's actually called the trollrumma. But these are much later invented words, just be aware of that, but they're all referring to this Sami type of drum. In the Sami tradition, the drum is used by the Noaidi, the spiritual leader, in order to work himself up into a trance. He drums, and his free spirit is said to leave the body. This is what we would call astral travel, or in the Norse tradition is what we would call sending their hugid out of their body in order to do whatever spiritual work they were meant to do. Usually it was to give prophecies, but there are other uses, but that's the main idea, sending your spirit or your hugid out of your body. This also seems very much like the Norse Seiðr ritual, which were sometimes said to be Finns, but sometimes it was a completely ethnic Norse female. So again, it's possible that drums were used by the Norse Völva, or witches. We just don't have any records of it, and we actually do have a couple good detailed records of a Seiðr ceremony, and no drums are to be found anywhere there. But interestingly enough, in the Norse studies, Seiðr was actually a feminine art, a magic practice, and it was very shameful if a man did it. But in the Sami culture, not all the time, but we have a couple sources that say drums were only for men, and females were not even allowed to touch the drums, or else it loses their power. So kind of the opposite of the Norse Seiðr, which was more feminine. Another source, we actually do, the oldest one of any of the Norse sources mentioning a drum comes from the 12th century. It's after Norway became Christian, but barely. There still would have been an underground Norse community following their old religion, and definitely the Sami or Finn pagan religion was still in full effect. The source is Historia Norvegia, and that mentions a drum with symbols on it. The symbols were sea animals, a boat, a reindeer, and snowshoes. And in here, it describes a Finn spiritual leader apparently healing a dead woman, bringing her back to life by sending his spirit out into the world and taking the shape of a whale. Again, there are many other tales in the Norse sources of shape-shifting just like this, but this one is one of the oldest we have shortly after the Viking Age, and it is definitely a drum that is referred to in this source. Anyway, the traditional Sami drums, they are also painted with images, usually of the Sami gods, but it could be painted differently depending on the purpose and the region where it was from, different styles for the drums. One very interesting thing, though, they could also be used for battle during the 30 Years' War of the 1600s, so it's quite late on. But here, rumors were being spread around that the Swedes were winning their battles with the help of Sami witchcraft. And this led to the drums actually being banned and confiscated all the way up until the 1900s. They were made illegal and they were being confiscated, and you can still see some of these in the museums, these really old drums. This is another thing that makes me wonder if drums were maybe used 600 years before this 30 Years' War, when the Norse were pagan, and we just simply don't have any written evidence of it because they were trying to hide any evidence that they were used. Also remember how the Germanic tribes too used these things for war. They used to bang on their shields and growl for the same purpose and to win the battle. Does drumming or some sort of percussion lead us to some sort of altered state where we can give prophecies, astral travel, and even get into this battle-frenzied state too? I don't know. I don't speak about those things here out in the open, but I've covered this in a private video on Patreon for those who are interested. But one last source before I finish the video. In Gesta Danorum, it documents a kind of music performance, and it says here that a lyre was used, that kind of a stringed plucking instrument thing was used, not a drum. But anyway, it was a musician, and he performed for the Danish king Eirik Ejerud, who was the king of Denmark in the 1000s. And all the people there, once he started playing, they felt the urge to move their bodies and dance. And the king himself worked up too. He got worked up into a frenzied rage. It sounds very familiar to these trance-like states, and I wonder if there may have been a drum being played there too. So do with that source what you will. More details will be in the Patreon video there. But my final thoughts, did the Norse use drums like this, an animal hide stretched over a frame just like these? No way to be certain, but in my opinion, sure, sometimes. Definitely, though, we can classify any percussion instruments like hitting on a bucket or striking your shield. Of course, those types of things happen. Of course, they did that. But it would have been a specific class of people, witches, spiritual leaders, that kind of thing. But definitely these drums and ecstatic trance rituals would not have been something that the most masculine men of the time, the baddest ass warriors, would have taken part in. That was just not something that they would have done. But hope you enjoyed the video. Some sources, you can believe whatever you want. And yeah, either way, drums are a very cool and powerful tool, both spiritually, musically, everything. Like, it's one of the oldest instruments that human beings have. So that's all I have to say about that for now. But I hope you enjoyed. That's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.